and the struggle over the hot water machines. I will just a short remark, which I can say to your comfort, I will repeat after the session. But we are confronting one of our major logistical collective exercises when this session is over. Because when this session is over, and it will be on time, then you have exactly 15 minutes to go to your rooms and collect your coats, because it's going to be a relatively tempered climate out there in Eindhoven. The buses will leave at 6:45 outside the conference lobby, which is basically just downstairs here. You can see there is a big exit if you have not used it, and the buses are outside. And if you didn't get this message, don't worry, it'll be repeated in 2 hours' time. Thank you.
Er vi klar? Ja. Jamen, jeg sidder hernede med en lille skik selv. Ja. Good afternoon and welcome to the last session of this afternoon, plenary session, reform in sport, an inside job or outside intervention. My name is Mogens Kirkeby and I have the task to chair this session. Besides being a task, it is as well also a pleasure due to a nice panel, a nice audience, both here in Eindhoven, and also we would like to welcome those who follow us on the YouTube. We have a format of this session where we have 5 speakers. They will introduce the topic from their angle. You might say that some of them are insiders. I wouldn't say the others are outsiders, but they could be representing their position from what we learned this morning, from an independent position, a relative independent position, or an operational independent position. Altogether, there are 5 speakers, and then we have 2 extra panelists who will also be able to comment on the speakers and join the dialogue. In the spirit of play the game, we will allow for debate, at least for 1 hour. As Jens Andersen told you, just before, we have a sharp back end. So I ask you all to be precise and brief in the question and as well in the answers. The speakers of today is, as I mentioned, both insiders and people who see this topic from outside. The first speaker is Hans-Joachim Eckert, who to some extent has been both inside and outside, but at this moment I think you are from outside. Please welcome Hans-Joachim.
Okay. Okay, take this. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first I will thank you for the invitation, and I will say I'm very proud for all the people, and they can be proud for organizing and managing this Congress. It's really, for me, a top event. Well, independent ethics committee, can it work in sports? This will be my theme. We have heard quite a lot of corruption the whole day, and I will tell you, ethics and moral values are the basic for life as whole, not only sport, for life at all. Sports and matches only for profit will destroy the principles of a fair play. Society, that means all of us, must ensure that there are rules for sport and the organizations for sport as well. Talking about the independent ethics committees or other ethics structures in big sports organizations or federations such as FIFA or the IOC means talking about three aspects. Is there a need to have those ethics structures? Is there a need to have independent ethics structures? And do the big sports organizations really want to have them? Yes, and for me there is no doubt we need those structures. And sports organizations need a strong guideline to control their officials handling the contracts, the money flow, as well as the bidding principles for big sports events. From my experience as a former prosecutor and a judge for nearly 40 years, in economic crimes, in money laundering, in organized crime, it is always the same. The people are greedy. And people want to have the power. And if both is together, this is definitely very fine. And now look on the big sports organizations and the main people on the top of these organizations. They have the power and they have a lot of money. Not all, but very often. And another thing is, they don't want to be controlled. Definitely from nobody. They want to do and work for them alone. And for me, there is no difference between the managers of the big companies worldwide. In my court, I have some of them sitting in the courtroom, and there is definitely no difference between the big officials of FIFA or a manager of one of the big companies I had as well. And you look, where are the big organizations placed? In Switzerland. It's only for the lakes and for the mountains and for the snow? Oh, I see. You know why. It's for the tax and it's for the freeness for working there. And you must see all these organizations definitely have no control from outside. This is a difference with a company. There is a board and the duty to give an account to the shareholders. There are no shareholders in FIFA. This is a problem. But it's not only football. We have corruption and doping and all these things, even bike lists, snookers and cricket as well. And you can take nearly every sport. Doping in biathlon, very common. Have you ever seen them running 10, 20, 50 kilometers? That's what we want. That we want to be glad 2006, the fairy tale in Germany. But this is the other part of the big companies. Mohammed bin Hammam was one of the first I banned lifelong in my job in FIFA. It was December 2012. And it came from the double event given by the Executive Committee 2010 in December to Russia and Qatar to host the World Cup. After this decision, there were allegations worldwide against FIFA for the choice of these two countries. Russia and Qatar, it's bloody hot there, and there are even social things most people don't accept. Under the pressure of the media, the former president of FIFA, Mr. Blatter, decided to install a group of experts under the leadership of Mark Peter, professor of law in the University of Basel, and at that time even having a mandate for OECD for combating corruption. These experts made several proposals for internal controlling processes in FIFA, like control of the flow of the money, for a better governance, compliance, and an independent ethics committee. And this ethics committee, independent, was installed 2012 in summer. This is very important and essential. The nomination of the chairman of this independent body came from outside. It doesn't came from inside. This expert group nominated 6 persons, and the executive committee had the chance to choose. That's why I became chairman of one of the chambers. The independent ethics committee could work from middle of 2012 to middle 2017. These are the reforming. I think you will get this presentation. I gave it to the Congress so we can read it later. These were the reforms, even handling how long a president can work. 2 terms are 4 years enough, or 3 terms for 4 years. Think about the president of the African Confederation, Mr. Hayatou. I think he was in job about 35 years. And this is the soil for corruption, being a long time in the same position. Very important is that we could change the Ethics Code 2012. We didn't write him very new, but quite a lot of articles we make a little bit harder. And the structure of the Ethics Committee you will find even, and you will find it on the website. One article is very, very interesting. It is the duty to collaborate with the independent bodies of FIFA. You have to tell the truth. You have to give your email accounts. You have to give your bank accounts for the investigations. So we don't need, in this type of ethic committee, we don't need it, the tax authorities, the prosecution office, or the police. This is the time before Mr. Blatter was banned. And there were dark clouds over FIFA, May 2015. The American made a big arrest. A lot of people were taken in arrest in Zürich. What was the reaction of FIFA? Only some people in FIFA were criminals. The rest is all okay. The reaction of the Independent Ethics Committee was on the same day the provisional ban of 11 members of FIFA. Back to the beginning, to the questions. Is there a need to have those ethic structures? Yes, definitely we need it. Because we need the possibility for the organizations themselves to polish their own organization without police and prosecutors. But if it doesn't work, the prosecutor and the police should come and do the work. Yes, somebody must ensure the fairness, the transparency in sport, no corruption, no doping, no contracts with pressure on the bidders. Independent people, yes. Independent must be, because coming from the inside, there will be always a pressure to these people from a president or somebody on the top. And there is no problem being paid from the organization. Comparing with the big companies, they have compliance departments and they are paid as well from the company. To ensure the transparency, you have to need independent people on the top of ethics committees. Does sport organizations really want to have independent people? I don't think so. Just to have a look on the people which were involved: Blatter, Platini, Chuck Blazer, Mr. 10%, Jeffrey Webb, demands for change, need for practical control and political control. We need somebody, an institution, to control our big sport organizations. Last, the countries, the regions, the cities have to pay a huge amount of money having the honor to host the big sports event. They have to pay for all the sport facilities, the roads, the trains, and all the security. This costs billions of dollars. What about coming back from the big sports organizations? What are they doing? Do they pay? This is a problem for me, and that's why I ask for, let's say, political help to control big sports organizations together with independent ethics committees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Joachim Eckert, for very clear advice. A little bit of inside work, and if it doesn't work, we call for some outside interventions. Next one is for sure an insider, both play the game insider, but also IOC. The floor is Dick Pounds, please.
Thank you very much. I have quite an easy thing to do today, which is to, if we could turn the clock back at the IOC and look at a number of our recent decisions, what might we have done that would have made us be in a better position today? The first one is the decision about Russia, and in particular the McLaren report. As some of you will know, I chaired the initial commission on corruption in athletics in Russia, and Professor McLaren's report dealt with the broader spectrum of corruption. As far as his report was concerned, I submit that there was really no reason to doubt the findings of a very experienced and professional investigator. For the IOC to have dismissed those findings as mere allegations, I think was a big mistake and unwarranted in the circumstances. So that's where we got off the road. We could easily have responded immediately prior to the games in Rio on the basis of the McLaren findings. One of the elements that was raised by the IOC is the balancing of collective responsibility with individual justice. It's a concept with which I can certainly live, although I must say I do have a view that if you're part of the system, you're part of the system, and you have to bear your share of the responsibility of that system. But if you accept that individual responsibility is a factor, that could have been achieved. There could be individual invitations to participate in the Olympic Games given by the IOC as the owner to those who are in a position to demonstrate that they were outside the Russian system and therefore had been tested independently in other countries. And okay, if you can establish that, you're welcome to participate, but as our guest, not as a representative of Russia, not behind a Russian flag. And this, some people start to have the feeling that participation in the Olympic Games is a right. In fact, it's a privilege. And the International Olympic Committee is entitled to invite those who are to comply with the conditions, and they don't have to demonstrate that they're violating a right by not introducing people or permitting them. The third element I thought that where we could have done better was not to have delegated to the international federations the responsibility of deciding which of their athletes were entitled to participate under their own rules as opposed to the IOC rules. I found that in many cases the international federations were conflicted, either as a result of Russian involvement in their own management or in a perceived dependence on Russia as the host country for many of their events that might not otherwise have attracted hosting attention. I thought the use of what are called Olympic summits was a mistake. These were participants that were selected by the IOC to participate in summits that have absolutely no juristic value or authority or justification in any event. There was a ritual unanimous decision announced at the end of every such summit, responding to pre-prepared positions. I know there was one where the morning of the meeting of the Olympic summit, a 17-page paper was presented with a conclusion, and not a single comma was changed in the course of this extended study by the Olympic summits. It also, if you go back to the reforms that we instituted following the Salt Lake City scandal in 1999, where we had 3 sets of members who come from specific communities. We had 15 athlete members, we had 15 IOC International Federation members, and 15 selected from the National Olympic Committees. There's your summit. It's already there. It's kind of insulting to the members that were picked in those capacities not to be involved in the so-called Olympic summits because they actually came from those very communities that were supposed to be part of it. We've had a number of our members that find themselves in difficulties, some of which are criminal in nature. And I think the International Olympic Committee could have been much quicker and much more decisive in dealing with those members, rather than simply saying, well, it's true they've been accused of this, that, and the other thing, and will send us information. We'll think about what to do in that circumstance. And here the decision for the IOC is not to decide on the criminal guilt or non-guilt of our members, but whether or not their conduct and their particular situation brings our institution, the IOC, into disrepute or potential disrepute. And we should have been much more proactive in imposing provisional sanctions on those members while the situation plays itself out. And a provisional sanction or suspension does not amount to any determination of guilt or innocence, but the standard of proof in possible damage to the organization is much lower than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. All we need is a balance of probabilities that the IOC is put into difficulty as a result of the conduct in order to act. And it bears remembering that back in 1999, we expelled 10 members of the IOC, and there was no criminal allegation at all. It was simply a matter of their conduct brought the IOC into disrepute. So I think the IOC and its ethics commission have to be a lot more rigorous in terms of their activities. And for example, I know as a matter of fact that complaints to the IOC Ethics Commission in respect of my former colleague Carlos Nuzman from Brazil had been coming for years. I mean, there must be a file that thick in the IOC. And as far as I can tell, nothing was ever done until there was a criminal prosecution or investigation lanced. And then I thought we may even have overreacted. The final point that I would raise at this stage, and I'm happy to take questions during that the discussion period, is the mantra we have from our current leadership of unity through diversity. I think what's really important and implicit in that is that the diverse views be expressed and be given consideration, and that a variation from whatever the orthodox position may be should not be regarded as heresy, but simply the expression of something that should be considered, may not be accepted, but it needs to be considered. And I think if you don't do that, your risk is that you generate diversity out of what should be unity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these consideration on what could have been done if we should have a national agreement on sport within the Council of Europe. 38 countries voluntarily collaborate on sport, and our next speaker is the Executive Secretary, Stanislas Frossard.
Thank you very much to the organizers. That's a pleasure to be part of this great conference. And today I will have the honor and opportunity to share an update on the International Sport Integrity Partnership, which is a recent initiative taken by international organizations, governments, and sports organizations. The idea was in the air for a while, and it was referred to as the International Sport Integrity Partnership. It was first mentioned in the conclusion of the UK Anti-Corruption Summit that took place in May 2016. Then it was echoed by the Council of Europe Conference of Ministers responsible for sport, which took place in November 2016, and more recently by the IOC International Forum on Sport Integrity in February 2017. The initial promoters of this partnership were United Kingdom, OECD, and IOC. And I will now report on the outcome of the first meeting that took on 21st of June 2017. It gathered International Organization, Council of Europe, OECD, Commonwealth, and UNODC. From sports organization, there was IOC, ANOC, ASOIF, and GAIS representative, and representative from states from UK, France, Germany, Argentina, USA, Japan, China, and South Africa. It was decided to clearly focus on the risk of corruption and not to cover every integrity issue, because integrity may cover corruption indeed, but also match fixing, anti-doping, violence, and other issues that are well known here. And the missing link was to have a platform to work on the risk of corruption in sport. It's also a sign that there is now readiness to speak about corruption in sport, because for years it was a taboo and it was almost impossible to speak about this. When we shared documents or ideas, it always came back with feedback such as you should speak about the risk of corruption, as if there were no real corruption in sport. The mission statement of this partnership is to bring together international sports organizations, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and all the relevant stakeholders to strengthen and support efforts to eliminate corruption and promote a culture of good governance in and around sport. And there was a decision taken on the three actions that should initiate the work of this partnership. One is to develop case studies on public procurement procedure in the context of the organization of major sports events, based on the methodology and the experience OECD used for assessing the Universal Expo in Milano. Another task force will work on recommendation on the awarding process of sports competition. This is a typically sport organization internal process, but which is very relevant for the governments and public authorities that are investing a lot of money in these bidding processes. And the third is convergence of a good governance requirement, and I will develop it a little bit further later. So the organization is still not yet fully clarified, but for now there is a rotation of the supporting role for the meeting. The Council of Europe did it for the first meeting. The second meeting will take place in OECD in December. The idea is to have a plenary meeting once a year that should allow a broader basis to work on this partnership, and to take some more political decision on the strategic orientation of the working group and on its setting. The working group, which is the setting that I already described earlier, is due to meet twice a year and should remain in manageable size, 15 to 20 members. The next one is in December. And there is a coordination by a core group with UK, Council of Europe, OECD, UNODC, and IOC. The work task forces will work on concrete deliverables I mentioned earlier, and it's possible to involve NGOs, all the countries, and in the work of the task forces. Now I come to comments and analyze on this. The challenges that we face for now is on the setting of the working group to find the right balance between inclusiveness, balance between the different stakeholders, government, international organizations, sport, and within the government category between the continent. We are well aware that it should not have an over-representation from European countries that are more interested and more eager to join meetings that to date took place in Europe. And efficiency, because with a too large working group, it would be more difficult to work. Then another challenge is to achieve soon transparency and democracy that it is expecting from sports organization and government, and the partnership as such should fulfill that kind of principles. To find the right balance between substantive and institutional, we decided to start working on substantial issues and to set up task force to deliver concrete work, and not to start speaking about who may contribute in the future to the budget, which stakeholders should be represented in the working group, but it's always a challenge to find the right balance. To streamline an interest for the sports movement is that this partnership will allow to streamline the initiative, because so far the IOC, and namely Eckert, who is the director of ethics, the secretary of the ethics commission, she was invited and was had to contribute to several fora and working group from several international organizations. And with this partnership, there is some hope that it will help to streamline the initiatives from international organizations. Another challenge is to clarify the setting of the more political body, the plenary meeting I mentioned earlier, and to achieve representation from governments from all the continents. There was representative from governments from all continents at the first meeting, but most of them were by diplomatic representation, and in the future we hope to have representative from civil servants or from different specialized ministries. The commitment of the Council of Europe in this is to inform member states and our usual stakeholders. It's also to achieve a cooperation between EPAS, which is the body in charge of sports policies, and GRECO, which is the body in charge of monitoring anti-corruption policies. And that's a strength and an added value we can bring to connect these two worlds. We are trying to give political visibility to this initiative via ministerial meetings, parliamentary assembly, and committee of ministers, and in the future to propose European coordination on the position to be presented on behalf of European government in the partnership. Now a few words on task force number 3, which tried to aim at achieving a convergence of a good governance requirement between what is done by governments and sports organizations. It will be supported by Council of Europe, the two other task force being supported by OECD. And it will start focusing on specific governance features that are relevant to the risk of corruption, and namely term limits, financial transparency, and conflict of interest. And the intention is to start from existing benchmark indicators such as the Sports Governance Observer, the ASOIF review criteria, and to see whether one can find a consensus on refining the requirement on these areas. And in the future, it should serve as a common reference for government and sports organization. And there is a readiness from governments and even from ASOIF to take this into consideration. The challenge is that since now more and more governments are taking an active role on promoting good governance within the national sports movement, to have compatible requirement stemming from international sports movement via IOC, ASOIF, International Federation, and from governments, so that a national sports organization has the same requirement to fulfill in terms of good governance, to satisfy requests from its government and from its international federation. As conclusion, I would mention that we have now a unique opportunity to join forces to address corruption in sport, as we do in other topics. In other topics, it's not unusual to discuss on anti-doping policies, violence, but corruption was a more difficult topic to address. It will allow to address some new issues, such as procurement in the context of major sports event, to foster transparency and open dialogue on governance requirement. Here again, there was a protective attitude from all stakeholders to develop their own good governance requirement and not to share with all the kind of actors. To promote good governance standard in the sports movement, and to keep mobilizing government and sport organization. It's not a magic wand that will address all the governance issues, all the problems of corruption, but we have an opportunity to do something more with this partnership. And our challenge is now to fulfill this potential and deliver results according to the topics decided for the 3 task forces. And I hope that in 2 years I will have or someone else will have the opportunity to report, to play the game on the results of this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan, for this promise. And thank you for establishing at least a partnership on working for or towards anti-corruption. Has been discussed quite several times. What is mechanism to be done, and at least now there is a partnership. You can already now prepare your comments and questions, and if it's a question, it has to be brief. If it's a comment, you can already now post it at the conference app. It's pretty easy. It can be very long, and it can also be very short, but thank you to you who have already done that. Start doing it if you haven't been on the conference app, or start thinking what should be the questions for the panel in a few minutes. The next speaker is normally pretty straightforward, pretty direct, and I guess he will also be that today. The title of the presentation seems to indicate that: Changing the Dirty Game, How to Reform Sports Integrity Industrial Complex. Declan Hill, please.
Adolfo Largos was until last week a TV executive in Mexico City. Worked for the largest Mexican television station, television channel, Televisa, roughly equivalent to the Brazilian TV Globo in terms of reach, power, political influence in Mexico. In a courtroom thousands of miles away from his office in Mexico City at the Brooklyn FIFA trial, Adolfo Largos was named as receiving and paying out tens of millions of US dollars to obtain TV rights. He was named in that trial beginning on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Sunday afternoon, Mr. Largos went for a bike ride in Mexico City. He was murdered. Shot in the stomach. Shot in the stomach, actually, Brian may appreciate this, while he was cycling. I know that there are many journalists, I'm one among you, who are sharpening your metaphorical teeth right now, saying, well, it's obvious that he was murdered because of his connection with the FIFA trial. Don't say that. Don't say that. That is sheer hypothesis and conjecture. You'd also like to jump to the conclusion that he was murdered because it would be convenient for the Mexican television station to remove the one man who may know who paid the bribes, how the bribes were paid, and how the money flowed upwards across the Mexican media and political establishment. Ladies and gentlemen, that too would be conjecture. But I would like to point out to everybody in the room that it certainly was a very convenient murder. I speak no ill of Mr. Largos, but his death must have relieved many people in the Mexican media and political establishment. Ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, the world has changed. It's changing as we speak in a Brooklyn courtroom. Women are changing it. They're arguing in front of a female judge. The prosecutors, the prosecution team is led by a woman. Those initial push to clean up FIFA was by Loretta Lynch, the former Attorney General. There is, by the way, many allegations in that FIFA trial of murder, death threats, kidnapping. I've been through the thousands of pages of court documents that were filed online. But there's one document that really stands out. There's a meeting this fall, and the defense lawyers come in, and they are very high-priced legal people. And the prosecutors come in, and they're in front of Pamela Chen, and they're arguing something that my new friend and colleague Minky Warden will tell you about, the RICO statutes. And RICO is put specifically for prosecuting organized crime. Not a single person in that room argues that FIFA, CONMEBOL, CONCACAF, and all these other organizations weren't criminal organizations. They're not arguing anymore whether it should be a mob trial. The defense lawyers say, hey, we're not arguing that. We're just arguing that our particular individual clients weren't implicated in that. And you've got a bunch of turncoat people. This is unprecedented. It casts doubt on the Play the Game National Sports Governance Index, which last time I checked rated FIFA highly. This is a significant game changer for all of us in this room. And the question is, and I speak to everybody's intellectual soul tonight, have you changed? Are you upping your game? It's not enough anymore to talk about ethics and regulations and codes of conduct. If you're dealing with an organization that lawyers, defense and prosecution and judge are saying was a criminal organization, then we really have to start bringing in new tactics, new analysis, and new ways of working. Richard Pound talked about turning the clock back. My friend and colleague Stanislas Frossard talked about taboo subjects. So let's take a brief trip down memory game when Play the Game started in the late 90s and early 2000s. You remember this gentleman, Lance Armstrong? There were a few crazy people, Niels Christian Jung, David Walsh of the Sunday Times, who said that Lance Armstrong not only was doping, but he was systemic, part of a systemic doping thing. There was another gentleman, many of you may have heard of him, his name was Jens Weinreich. My goodness, we thought he was a lunatic. Him and my intellectual mentor, Andrew Jennings, were droning on and on about corruption at FIFA and this scandal called ISIL, and how many people had received payoffs. My friend Laura Robinson was talking about sexual abuse among athletes. Most people outside Play the Game thought these guys were crazy. A few people inside Play the Game thought these was crazy. These were, as Stanislas said, taboo subjects. People wouldn't talk about them. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, that has changed. So there are two fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves as researchers, as journalists, as academics, as lawyers, as people in this field. Have we changed with the time, and are we guilty of aggressive naivety here at Play the Game? And with all due respect to the common zeitgeist, the common spirit of Play the Game, I think we are very naive. We're almost becoming aggressively naive. We are dealing with criminal syndicates at times. We're dealing with mafiosa at times. Not everybody, not every sports official, sports organization, sports institution is criminal. Not everybody involved in it is criminal. But there are a significant number there. And we have to stop pretending that it isn't. Let me suggest the other thing that has moved on. And that is that, as I really like Stanislas' word, is taboo. Used to be that a few of us would say that there are problems and there would be a lot of denial. Now everybody says that there are problems. And many institutions have now copied the tactics of the tobacco industry of the 1980s and 1990s. They've set up, quote, independent third-party agencies. They're paying, quote, independent academic experts. They've hired consultants to say and push and fabricate the debate, to change what we look at. So, my simple solution at Play the Game, this is a whole new chapter that we can start to discuss, is we have to have the very basic protocols that the public health institutions have put into place since the great scandals of the 1980s and 1990s. We must know who is talking. When Ezequiel Fernandez-Mores and I had a heated debate at the last session about the Brooklyn FIFA trial, we had a genuine debate. And I had no doubt that Ezequiel Fernandez-Mores has not received funding from a third-party agency set up by the Qatar government. I am certain that hang on, is this true, by the way, Ezequiel, or are you shaking your head back there? Please relieve me of my doubts, brother. Thank you. I know that, I'm sorry, by the way, I shouldn't even make that joke. I know that Ezequiel has not received money, nor has he taken money from a private gambling company. However, just for one moment, turn and look at the person beside you. Because there are people in this room who have received money, and we don't know about it. And I'm not saying that you are necessarily guilty of corruption, guilty of collusion, that your viewpoints are not worthy of discussion, but damn it, I want to know. And if you're not, if you are accepting money from these guys, why aren't you open about it? Why don't you just tell us? So the golden rule, which I suggest for all academic works on match fixing, on corruption, is just do what the public health people do. State what conferences you've been to, where you've received your money from, your past, present, and future contracts. And we can start slowly to raise our game. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
I think this session turned into the solution session. The golden rule. Thank you very much, Declan, for this suggestion. I think it will be discussed later. Now, for sure, we go to an insider. Niels Nygaard is the president of the National Olympic Committee and Sports Confederation of Denmark, and actually recently also a little bit more an insider, as he was elected to the vice president of the European Olympic Committee. Niels, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this conference. Thank you very much to Play the Game for taking these initiatives, for having these conferences. I've been attending most of the conferences since the beginning in the late 1990s. And I must say that a number of times, and maybe even a lot of times, I didn't quite agree with everything that was said at these conferences. But today I must admit that there were probably more issues raised which were important and which were actually true than I was prepared to say yes to some years ago. I still have a big faith in international sport and in what international sport can do. And I still believe that sport can and will be able to do things better than sport has been able to do so far. But I, as I said before, must admit that there are some big challenges. And in answering the question for this debate, I must say that we need to work fast within sport in order to keep having it as an inside job to make a better situation. And if we don't do a better job, I suppose that there will be some kind of intervention. In my opinion, there should not be intervention from outside. There should be pressure. Conferences like this, the media, politicians, others should put pressure on sport
in order to get a better situation. But it is really the responsibility of sport itself to make things right. And I'm still so naive that I believe that in the years to come, we will have a better situation than we have today. And when I'm talking about outside not making intervention in sport, I mean it's in the way that sport is governed, the way that the decisions are taken, the way we structure ourselves is really up to sport ourselves to take care of that. But of course, when there are criminal offenses, criminal economic offenses, other offenses, sports should be treated exactly the same as business, as ordinary people and so on. So whenever there are criminal offenses, of course, outside authorities have to take action. In Denmark, NOC Denmark, we have decided some years ago that we want to make an impact in international sport, that we want to take part, that we want to try and help to make a difference. And the reason why we've taken this decision there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that it is within the international sports organizations, international federations, the Olympic movement and so on, the decisions are taken about how can we deal with our sport, how are the rules, which disciplines will take part in the Olympics, where will the championships take place and so on. And if we want to influence that, which we of course want to influence, we have to take part. We have to be there. We have to be there to take responsibility. But the other big reason for us to be engaged in international sport is that in Denmark, in the Nordic countries, and a big part of Western Europe and other parts also in the world, we have some values in the society and in the sports movements in those countries, which we think are important. And if we want international sport to develop in a better direction, if we want international sport to share those values, we do have to take part, we do have to get involved. And in Denmark, even though we are quite a small country with only 5.5 million inhabitants, we have been able to get people elected to a number of important jobs in international sport. 4 years ago, we had Paulina elected as the president of the International Badminton Federation. 1 year ago, we had the Danish president elected as president of the International Sailing Federations. And if we look at another 15, 20 of the important sports in the world, we have been able to have people elected to the boards of these international federations. So it is actually possible to have people elected if we prepare ourselves, if we really believe in what we are doing. And one of the things we are doing in Denmark, together with the other Nordic countries and together with Holland, is that we have an international leadership education. Because if we want to go and have influence in the international sports federations, we cannot come there as mere amateurs without having any knowledge, any tools to work with. We need to be prepared, we need to be educated in order to be able to make a difference. As it was said in the introduction a few minutes ago, I was elected Vice President of the European Olympic Committees last Friday in Zagreb. I think 4 years ago it would have been impossible for me to get elected as vice president. Because of the way from Danish sport we have stated our opinions about doping, about good governance, about transparency, about how to select hosts for the international championships, about diversity, about sustainability and other questions. 4 years ago, it would have been impossible to get a top job in this European Olympic Committee, which consists of 15 national Olympic committees. We have a situation where many countries for many years have been working with its own culture and have been always working in a manner where it has been difficult to make changes, and where it has been an old boys network where you believe the way you have been doing things for many years is the right way to do it. But since I was elected with 27 out of the 50 votes in Europe, this really marks a difference. It marks the difference that in quite a number of countries, and not only in northwest of Europe, but in many parts of Europe, there is a growing sense, growing acknowledgement about that if we still have to have a future in international sport, we have to do things differently. I know it's a long way, it's a hard way to get into having these new positions and having these new ideas come through. And therefore, you, as I said before, you have to educate yourself, you have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to have the patience, because you cannot change this overnight. It really takes some time to do it. In order to have these changes, you have to have of course, the pressure, but you also have to have new people being engaged also locally and nationally. Because if we don't get people with the right values, with the right education, with the right desire to do things differently, it's not possible to have these changes. We heard Dick Pound tell about the situation in the IOC and how you would have liked a lot of changes taking place earlier. I think there's still a long way to go for the IOC, but I'm not that pessimistic about that the future will be more bright. And I think the statement of the President, Thomas Bach, about change or be changed is something for everybody to listen to, because if we don't change the way we are doing things, we will be changed. And I want that this change, we shall do that ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels. Before we turn into the question and answer session, I think it's a nice variety of solution suggested. Internal ethic committee is necessary. Do not have summits without decision power. The golden rule for all of us, and pressure from outside, but no intervention. Change or be changed? I would say it sounds very obvious. For me, the question is, changed by whom? It will not fall from heaven. Will it come from authorities? Will it come from others? I think it's obvious that it will happen, but the question is, who will change those who don't want to be changed? Before we go to the discussion, we have two more short interventions. Paulina Tomczyk, representing EU athletes, and Brian Cookson, past president of the UCI and British Cycling. First, Paulina, please.
Thank you very much, Mogens. You didn't give me a classification if I'm an outsider or insider, but I think I would, as you will see, representing the European Confederation of Athletes, Independent Unions and Association, I would definitely consider myself as an outsider from the Olympic movement. So in my short intervention, I would just like to focus on few points and explain why good governance is so important to athletes. It's because athletes' lives are obviously fundamentally affected by sports governance, and so they have very strong interest in making sure that the highest standards of governance are met. And corruption and conflict of interest in sport can have a substantial and very negative impact on position of sports people, as poor governance can increase the risk of threats to integrity such as harassment, sexual abuse, match fixing, or doping. At the same time, athletes do have the right to a sporting environment that is well-governed, which is free of corruption, manipulation, and cheating, and an environment that protects, respects, and guarantees the fundamental human rights of athletes. So good governance and tackling corruption must involve accountability to the stakeholder that is often marginalized by the sports organizations, which are the athletes. Athletes are at the heart of every sport, and their role in the governance must be enhanced to reflect on that, and they have to be given an adequate position. So a simple consultation of an internal athletes committee or commission, which do not have an actual say, an actual power in decision making, it's not enough. Because athletes should be able to negotiate with sports on equal terms and from an independent position as partners. So this is a requirement of athletes' freedom of associations and the right to be represented by their democratic and independent organizations. So athletes' union want and need to work in partnership with public institutions and with sports to work towards this goal of maintaining, of first restoring and then maintaining the good governance in sport. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulina. And Ryan, please.
Thank you, Mogens. I'll just comment very briefly on each of the speakers and the issues that they've raised, which I think are really interesting and exciting and challenging, of course. The Independent Ethics Committee, well, can it work? Well, we spent a lot of time in the last 4 years when I was president of the UCI reviewing the constitution, changing the governance, forcing through all of those kind of issues to really modernize the structure of the organization of our international federation. We did establish and have established an Independent Ethics Commission that is absolutely separate from the organization. And so we put a lot of work into changing those things. Possibly one might say that's one of the reasons why I'm speaking to you as an ex-president now rather than a current president. Anyway, leaving that aside, issues of the IOC, would it do things differently? Well, you know, I think there's a lot of issues around the IOC that go back in the roots to the nature of the beast, as it were. It seems to me that IOC, the mistake that perhaps many of us in sport and the wider world make is to expect that the IOC is powered by democracy, and to a degree it is, but it's much more powered by patronage, really, isn't it? And perhaps that's a little controversial, but until that changes, I think the IOC is always going to be faced by those kind of issues that are generated by that type of governance. And I'm optimistic, as a number of speakers are, that things can change and will change for the better, and I'm sure that President Bach would want them to change for the better. In terms of the international partnership against corruption, I think there are real great challenges for all of our sports in that area. Seems to me that a lot of that is based around gambling and the ubiquity of betting. There's been massive growth in recent years in gambling online and so on. And in my view, it's insufficiently regulated internationally by governments, and that's going to continue to impact on us in sport unless there is a sea change in the way gambling is dealt with by governments, who are perhaps only too happy to take the revenue that comes with this, which in many ways
can be antisocial. And I speak of, my dad was a gambler. He spent a lot of time on the horses, and I asked him in his later years, did he think that he was ahead of the game there or behind? And he said to me, well, you know, I think on balance I'm just slightly ahead. And then a few months later I read a piece of research that said basically that's what all gamblers tell themselves. So I think there's something about human nature in that. The changing the dirty game, well, there's some scary things in there, and you know, I think what we've found certainly in cycling, I've felt this for a long time, that the doping in particular and cheating generally inevitably leads quite quickly into a chain that gets to criminality, bribery, money laundering, intimidation, and even, as we've heard, perhaps murder. It seems to me that sport really needs to have the support of governments and police authorities, judicial authorities around the world to be able to make a real difference here. And that's something that we need to really collaborate on, I would suggest, with governments. I like the concept of aggressive naivety as well. I think that's a good one. I'll borrow that for future speeches that I make, if you don't mind. I'll give you credit. In terms of the last speaker and sport taking responsibility, I really do think we have to put our own house in order. So it's obviously gratifying to see so many people here from sport, from international federations, national Olympic committees, national federations, and so on. And I do think we do have the will to do those things. Getting people elected, getting people out there adhering to the highest standards, walking the walk, not just talking the talk, making those changes. It's badly needed. We need to keep that effort going. I did my best for a number of years in sport, and I'm going to carry on doing that where I can from outside the International Federation and the National Federation. So that's my perspective on what we've just heard, and I'm very interested to hear everybody else's. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina and Brian, for summing up and giving advice from a past president to a newly elected vice president. I hope you listen carefully, Niels. The panel is now yours. You are the one to handle the next 45 minutes. If you have a question, you raise one hand. If you have a very important question, you raise both hands. We have microphones, and I think we have Nikki Dryden here. Yes, please. The microphone is on its way. Who is the next one?
Hi, Nikki Dryden. I'm an Olympic swimmer and an attorney. I'd like to hear from the people inside about what their thoughts are on this idea that sport actually has been able to keep the privilege of working autonomously. Because I would posit that sport has lost that privilege in society of being able to operate autonomously. And then, in fact, we do need interventions externally.
Thank you. A very direct question to those who feel inside. Niels, Declan, I think it's for you.
Hello, yes. I believe it is very important that sport keeps our autonomy. But of course, in order to do that, we have to deserve it, and we have to work with good governance. One of the reasons why we should keep our autonomy is that sport is really a lot more than what we are just reading about in FIFA, in IOC, in IAAF, and so on, and where we hear about doping and corruption and all those bad things. 98% of what's going on in sport is really, really very positive, is really fantastic for society. And at least in the European model, it's based on the autonomy of sport. It's based on a lot of volunteers. It's based on a lot of clubs and so on. And if we start ruining that system, it would be very, very bad for sport. I believe it's the right way to have this connection between sport for all, and also the elite sport. And I think that the model they have in the US, where it's only commercial companies taking care of elite sport in a number of different sports, is a very, very bad way to do things. So we have to keep our autonomy here in Europe, but of course we have to deserve it.
What will be your first initiative in the European Olympic Committee to deserve it?
There are a lot of things to work with. We have to work with transparency about how we are making our decisions. We have to form an ethics committee. So we have to make it work so that it's the whole executive committee and our commissions that are really involved in the work and in the decisions. So there are a number of issues to take care of.
Dick and then Declan, please.
I think in answer to the question that autonomy now in sport has to be earned. It can't simply be asserted. And you'll know as a lawyer that when sport started in the late 19th century, it was completely apart from the legal order of the day. And that legal order has expanded to the point where it now includes sport. And therefore, if sport wants to say we're special and we should run what we're doing, we've got to earn that right and the respect of the community in order to make that claim.
Thank you. We have also a short comment from Declan, but before that, we have another speaker and a second one over here. More, please make yourself visible. Thank you. And also for the panel, if you feel like to interrupt, to comment, you're most welcome. Declan.
Minky, sport is a meat plant that's producing toxic sausages. I mean, come on. You know, all due respect to the chap who's sitting beside me, will probably punch me out for saying this. If you, this is the same language you hear from the meatpacking plant owners, saying, don't send in the government inspectors, we'll self-regulate. Well, who wants to eat a sausage from a self-regulated meatpacking plant? Please put your hand up. I mean, it's just a basic in any other industry, and quite frankly, sport, and this is a good quote, sport is far too important to be left to sport officials.
Paulina, and then we take a question from here. Just a short comment from Paulina, please.
I would just like to comment a bit on that discussion of autonomy. I think the problem is we have been hearing for a moment now that autonomy is conditional. It's the condition is good governance, that autonomy must be earned, but we still have one corruption scandal after another, and sport governing bodies still claim their autonomy. And I would just, since I've heard from Mr. Nygaard about the European sports model, I would have to comment on that a little bit as well, because this is something that we have been hearing from President of IOC, Mr. Bach, lately, in regards to European Commission and more particularly the competition, DG competition. In the case of ISU sport, it's about the complaint of 2 Dutch speed skaters that were not allowed to compete in an event that was not authorized by ISU. So it's a clear breach of the free competition at the European level. At the same time, we have a very strong lobbying from the Olympic movement to deny their right to compete. So autonomy is very dangerous, and also in this way it can really negatively impact the lives of professional athletes and their possibility to actually make some money on their performances.
Thank you. Question from here. Please state your name and your question.
Yes. Andy Spalding. I'm a law professor at the University of Richmond in the United States. And I think I'm picking up on Declan's sausage metaphor. We've talked a lot about the FIFA trial in Brooklyn today, but it, of course, is not the only example of federal prosecutions of sports-related corruption. We see some in South Korea. We see some in Brazil. My question is, to what extent do these prosecutions herald a new era for promoting integrity in sport, and how far do you think formal criminal prosecution can go in promoting integrity in sport? Anybody?
Feel free.
I'll pick up just because we're talking about meatpacking plants at the moment. Hey, could I just say something to you, Andy? Because I'm still feeling a bit guilty about making a joke about my colleague and friend Ezekiel Fernandez-Moore while I was speaking. I just want to put it on the record. We disagree about the Brooklyn trial, but as I think everybody knows, there's no implication on Ezekiel. He's a great man and a great journalist who's broken stories that I haven't. I would actually agree with him in one thing, and that is that what I notice about the Brooklyn trial is that lots of foreigners are on trial there, accused of money laundering through American institutions. And I do wonder, where the hell are the American banks in the guilt thing? I mean, you're pumping through hundreds of millions of dollars in that trial, through Citibank, through Bassane Bank in Florida, through a number of them. And yet I haven't seen the FBI and DOJ go after those guys. That's a small side issue, so I won't hold on to the microphone anymore. But I do want to say that there has been selective process in those trials.
Anybody else who want to pick up on the recipe of a sausage? Niels?
Yes, I will take the challenge. I acknowledge that, for example, in Denmark, there are a few sausages that are which are full of toxic. We have more than 3 million people out of the 5 million people in Denmark who do sport. And I'd say if we had a different system, if we didn't have all the volunteers, if we didn't have the club system in Denmark, we would not have 3 million sausages. We would only have maybe 2 or 2.5 million sausages. And I think that by ruining a system which is working very, very well for most of sport, by letting a government or others take over to run the whole system would really be fatal for sport in Denmark. We got 15 medals in Rio for a small country, and I'm convinced that all those 15 medals, they were completely clean. If you would put in the system that you're suggesting in Denmark, we would never win so many medals. So I think it's really a disrespect of saying that the autonomy of sport cannot make a good system.
Thank you very much. I have 3 speakers over here. I need you to mark again those who have already showed your hands, and then you have one over here, please. Who were on the list? Yeah, you have a microphone, and next to here, red one, and over here. That's the order, please.
Kevin Nutley with the Round the Rings reporter. My questions are for Richard Pound. You aired your grievances about a number of decisions made by the IOC, led by President Thomas Bach over the past 2 years. As a general IOC member yourself, do you feel you had any real opportunities to share your concerns with President Bach or any of the executive committee members? And secondly, or outside of the media, and secondly, do you think that the 100-something members of the IOC, not on the executive board, have any real voice or decision-making power outside of host city elections, which we saw in September was just a rubber stamping of 2 cities that weren't torpedoed by public or political opposition? Thank you.
Well, I certainly think the strength of the IOC lies in the independence of its basic membership, and the events of recent months or pre-Rio, we have not had a chance to discuss something that has a huge impact on the perception of the IOC, the reputations of the IOC and its members. So that has been an issue, and it was certainly something I raised at the time in Rio, saying we need to have the members look at this. It's not just an executive board decision, and shouldn't be kept at that level.
Thank you. I have a question here, and then in the red jacket, please. Yes?
Yes, Hanna Marie Breivik, I'm from Norwegian television. I have a question for Hans-Joachim Eckert. Would you stand a chance with the ethics commissions and all the nice commissions in the FIFA if it wasn't for the FBI? Would we have had the FIFA scandal?
Well, if you have a look to the FIFA website, to the so-called milestones, so you'll see how many cases were solved up to May 2015. It is sure the right thing that the investigations of FBI gave some more input in the cases we still had hanging in FIFA Ethics Committee. And it's very, very clear if people confess during a case in trial in US, so we can use what they confess. That is quite more easier to work. But for me, the problem is the transparency of all these doing of the big organizations. For me, the outside, the media, they often don't understand what's going inside of the organizations. What about the money? What about, the competence for making decisions? Give 10 kids somewhere in Africa a ball and they will football playing. And we all want it to do further on. And I see all the people having sport, and they love sport, and they go to the stadiums, and there is a wave. They want to have it, the sport. But you even must see the devil on the other side. These are not a lot of people, but you must take measures, and you even need prosecutors and judges to take them out, and even take them in jail. But, for my opinion, only pressure, together with transparency, will have a better sport in the future.
Thank you. Next one, please.
Hi, my name's Alison. I'm from Fiji. Two issues that I'd like to raise. The first one is for Richard Pound. I was a little bit amused that you were looking at Russia, which is very recent history, and you didn't take the opportunity to look back at perhaps Salt Lake City or even going back to the Samarkand era in terms of what could have been done differently between now and that particular point in time. The second one is to no one in particular on the panel, but for anyone who is keen to take it up. It's a question about autonomy and accountability, and is autonomy absolute? So for me, I have no problem in terms of sports organizations running with the rules of the game on the field, but where there is taxpayers' money involved, that's a different issue, and I would argue that autonomy in that instance is not absolute.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question about Salt Lake City. I would say one of the differences in Salt Lake City is as soon as we had the evidence that something that we'd suspected was going on but had never been able to get evidence, we acted. From the time the first report came out to the time we expelled 10 of our members was, I think, 3 months. So we did act, and we did a considerable reform structurally and in terms of governance. And I think we went from thinking we were something of a club, and in a club you know what the rules are and what the proper conduct is. Well, we were wrong about that. Either they didn't know about the rules or they didn't care. And so we put in an ethics commission and a code of ethics and all of those things that I think moved us from one end of the scale of responsible governance to pretty close to the best practices in international operations. But we did that very quickly. And I think that was a difference between the recent activities and what happened in 1999.
I have 4 speakers on the list. They are all over here. The first one is here, and then I have actually one in front of you, and I have one over here, and then one in the back. Okay?
Thank you.
Please.
Jeff Schoenberg from Deakin University in Australia. And what we've heard a lot about today and on the panel has been around international sport, particularly the IOC, FIFA, corruption at the international level. But surely this happens at a lower level first. The people who are involved in this corruption don't just arrive on the international stage and then suddenly start engaging in, shall we say, dubious behavior. Is focusing on these issues at that international level almost waiting too late to address it? And how can we address these sorts of issues at national level bodies, at state and more regional levels, as a first step to maybe preventing that entrenchment of practices and behaviors at that international level?
That was a combined question and comment, I think, also visible at the conference app. Thank you. Anyone who want to comment it? Niels and Stan and Paulina. Short, please.
Yes, I think it's a very important question you are raising. I think the big problem in this issue is that international sport consists of about more than 200 different countries. The IOC has 205 or 206 national Olympic committees. And now most of us who are sitting here from Western Europe, from Canada, from Australia and so on, we are used to live in cultures and systems where there is at least a degree of decency and a degree of law, a degree of not having corruption and so on. But if you look at more than 100 of the countries that are members of the IOC have a totally different culture than ours. We of course believe that the culture in parts of Africa, in parts of Asia, in parts of South America is very bad. And personally, of course, I don't like what's going on there. But it's just a fact of life that international sport consists of so many different cultures, and therefore it's not that easy just to deal with that when you are an organization who claim to be democratic, where all the countries, whether they are democratic or not democratic, each shall have one vote. I think what IOC and FIFA and others can do is to have very strict rules when they give out money to the countries, that if they are not able to explain how they spent their money, they will not get the money, and we can go further in that direction. But it's not an easy issue to solve.
Stan and Paulina, please.
Yes, thank you. I agree very much with your statement because when people play responsibilities in international organizations, they are not coming out of the blue, and they have grown up in a sports movement. And if all what they have experienced in the sports movement at local, national level was authoritarian functioning, opacity, you cannot expect them to be democratic and transparent while playing a role at national level. And that's why we are putting a much stronger emphasis on promoting good governance at a national level now in preparing a recommendation to the member states. And we are not the only ones. So there was a workshop earlier this afternoon on a national initiative to promote good governance at national level. And I believe it's key to mainstream this movement and not solely to criticize IOC, UEFA and international organization when major scandals occurs, but to try to reach people at every level.
Paulina, please.
Just a very short comment. I agree that, of course, it's important to address problems in governance at every level. And I wanted to refer actually to Play the Game National Sport Governance Observer, because interestingly, some of the observations that have been made, if we compare the national and international sports federation, it seems that the national ones score better in transparency. That's the first thing. And the second one, that they are more cooperative. At the same time, the international sports governance, international sports organizations were not that much willing to cooperate with some outsiders that wanted to assess that governance. So I think this is an important part of that. And also that at the national level, often the only elements of good governance where there have really been good scores from national sports federations were the ones where there was a legal obligation to do something. For example, if there was a legal obligation to publish the report, there was 100%. So I think it's a good, maybe a suggestion as well that oversight by law is also very effective when it comes to sport governance.
Thank you. I have one speaker here, and then over here, and then in the back. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Jake Shelley. I'm a PhD student at Kingston University looking into anti-doping systems. And I have a question for Brian Cookson. You've said previously that if the rules weren't broken as regards TUEs, then that was the end of the matter. But the matter has dragged on, as you've seen. And I was wondering whether you understand the ethical concerns that people have with the apparent misuse of TUEs, given the timing and the substances that were involved that seem to be very convenient timings and very strong substances, which would normally be prescribed for serious medical conditions in the case of elite athletes in peak conditions. So I'm basically just asking whether you understand those ethical concerns that people have and whether you might have done anything different in your time as UCI president, looking back to minimize the misuse of therapeutic use exemptions in cycling. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that the TUE system that was operated, as it was operated a few years ago, and that's when the current cases that are causing comment that I guess you're referring to, that was whilst I was president of British Cycling, not president of the UCI. What I discovered when I became president of the UCI was that the TUE process as being implemented by the UCI was probably not as effective and efficient as it should have been, and therefore we changed the procedures internally to make sure that it was best practice. And I would not go so far as to say that the TUEs that were issued before that were broke the rules in some way. They were compliant in that that TUEs were issued under the procedures in place at the time. What I have said is that people should not be surprised if elite sportsmen and women and their teams push any rule to the absolute limit, and I suspect that's what was done there. Now, if you're looking to the future, and this perhaps is a debate that that the international federations can have with WADA about the appropriateness of the whole TUE system, well, I think that's another argument, another discussion that we can have, and I would certainly support a fairly severe tightening of the TUE regulations, which to me are perhaps capable of being interpreted in quite a forgiving way, shall we say. Frankly, if someone wants to take a substance that is otherwise banned under the regulations, then that if that's allowed in competition, then I think that's a very difficult scenario. I would suggest that perhaps a better scenario, apart from those that involve long-term medical treatment and so on, that is essential to the health of the individual. If we're talking about individual treatments and so on at a particular period of time in competition, frankly, I would say a much better rule would be, yeah, you can have your TUE, but you go home, you don't compete. That's certainly a direction that I would like to see that go, but that's not what the rules are at the moment, and so perhaps it's not a surprise that individuals and teams will push the rule to the very limit of its acceptability, and I suspect that's what's happened in the past.
Could I just add a little bit to that about the TUEs? As many of you may know, the WADA system was hacked, and they got into a file that dealt with the TUEs, which is kind of annoying to have that information out there. But what it did prove is that the TUE process had been properly followed in every single case that was where a TUE had been issued. And the WADA review of a TUE, especially one that has been challenged or suspected, is a very robust process. And you don't get a TUE unless you've got the entire file available, and there's no alternative non-prohibited drug or process treatment available. So it's pretty good. I mean, as Brian says, you can always improve these things, but as somebody connected with WADA, I'm satisfied that the existing process is pretty good, and you're not getting the home cooking TUEs that the family doctor might have issued many years ago.
Thank you. I have three on the list now. First here, and then in the back, and then here again.
My name is Florin Sharia. I'm working in the Romanian Football Federation as a good governance manager. So the question of reform in sport, of course, an inside job or outside intervention is in the Romanian Football Federation of highest importance and We dealt with this question for the last 3 years, almost 4 years, 3.5 years. I want to share some thoughts with you, of course, and out of these thoughts,
you have to be short if you want to be on the panel.
Yes,
you have a question or share something short?
I will have a very short.
Okay.
The problem is, and I completely agree with President Nygaard, is that the fundamentals of the reform of the phenomenon are inside of it, and actually they are in the capacity of the system to open up to as many participants and as many stakeholders as possible. Now comes the question, of course, how much can this system actually accept to open? Yeah, this is the question. Can it open like, I don't know, open society in the political meaning, or somewhere there will be a limit? A limit of understanding, a limit of acceptance? This is the question, yes?
Thank you.
I didn't find an answer until now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any feel like commenting or questioning or adding? No? In the back, and then we have here.
Thank you. My name is Edwin Schoon from NOS Television, the Netherlands. I have a question for Mr. Hans-Joachim Eckert. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, okay. Well, to use the metaphor of Declan with the sausages, we are currently very happy that in the US there's a trial on some toxic sausages, so to say. But there's also some sausages in Europe and in other parts of the world that are not on trial. And maybe they will be, we don't know. But for Mr. Eckert, the period you worked at FIFA inside, as your title says, an independent ethics committee, can it work? How do you look back this period? Was it for you independent enough on one side? And how do you look at the situation since you've left FIFA last March? There's a new situation. Are the sausages being judged in another way since?
Okay. First of all, coming from Munich, we have only white sausages and not red sausages. This is a difference. And I left FIFA in the middle of May this year. So, and I will talk about, well, the independence you ask for, we had the independence. In the time, as Mr. Blatter was president, there was definitely no reason, there's no doubt we could do our job. And FIFA paid all the investigations. For example, for Mr. Garcia and Borbeli, they paid quite a lot of money for the report. And later on, all the investigators worldwide were paid for asking the witnesses somewhere in the world, in South America and Asia and everywhere. And even the trial in Zürich, this is not so easy going, because you have, for instance, 5 judges from 5 continents, and you have to gather them in one trial for 1 day. And I always looked to finish a trial in 1 day. So we started usually at 9 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes it took very, very long in the evening. And to the independence, we were definitely independent, because I always declared to everybody in FIFA, if they want to influence me in a decision, I will go. And I definitely will not go very silent if somebody tries to influence me. But they didn't. The last 6 months, since May, the problem is the whole ethics committee was changed. It is the same as when you have a department in the prosecution office working together for 5 years in corruption cases, and you take them out and take some new prosecutors. It will take time to get all the knowledge of the old cases and to handle the new cases. So we have to wait if the ethics committee now will have new cases and they will do their job. We have now 4 decisions since May, but these cases were online since May, so we have to wait what's going on. Is it okay for you?
Yes, because you don't have a microphone, so we need to be okay. Now I'm sorry to say we do not make a good gender balance in the panel, but we did a good gender balance among the questions. I have now only one on the list, and we still have 15 minutes. That's an invitation, but first, please. Declan, okay.
So I have a question for my fellow panelist member. Why didn't you just release the Garcia report when he finished?
Well, the problem was when I got the Garcia report, it was 3 reports, you know, because Dr. Bobley made 2 reports and Garcia and him together made the rest. I had to decide what I can open, what could be published. And if there are people inside the report which should be investigated later, then it would be a fault to make it open that they are on the top for investigating. They can, for example, delete all the evidence. That's why I divided. Open sources like the Parliament inquiry in UK. These were all in the media. And all what in the media was I could open in my statement. And for the rest, I decided I have to protect the people, and I even have to protect the whistleblowers, the 2 ladies. Very difficult for the whistleblower, because one lady in Australia go to the media. She was in TV. She make interviews. And on the other side, she wanted to be protected. You must understand, this was a very small thing I have to decide. And then there was the decision of executive committee in Marrakesh. It was always a quarrel when the Garcia report will be published. And the executive committee decided it's on my own decision when I have finished, when I tell the cases have finished, and finished to the end means to cuss. And that's why some parts of the report were not published. This was the reason.
Now, here's what I understand, brother, because you've asked me, I must understand something. Here's what I understand, is that now the Garcia report has been published in total. Yes. So what's the difference between then and 2.5 years ago? So in other words, you're an inside man at that time. You were in charge of the ethics. You had an ability to just show clearly what is going on. And for goodness sake, you can just redact a man or a whistleblower's identity, just block it out. That many of the journalists in this room, we see redacted things.
I can tell you we have tried to blacken. And then if you black fairly for protecting the people inside, most of the pages will be only black. And the rest is for the journalists to know what happens. This was the problem. And we have, in these 2.5 years, we have several cases coming out from the Garcia report handled in our investigation chamber. No, never forget. We are handling the cases one after the other, and I think we needed one more year to open it.
My final question. Yes, right. Would you have a cup of tea with Mr. Garcia, seeing as he blackened your name and...
Well, I have no problem. I must tell you, we had a very good relationship starting our job together.
That was the start?
Yeah, that's what the start. And then it is very difficult to ask him why he went out of FIFA. And there may be some reasons outside I will not discuss with you, maybe on a cup of tea outside, but not in here.
Thank you. Thank you. So by now, after Declan Hill took my job as not chair but chef of this session. Super, thank you. The list is actually closed now for a moment because I have 4. And we start with Play the Game award winner, please.
Thank you. I'm picking up on something Niels said. You said, that you alluded anyway that Denmark, Australia, Canada, there aren't the kinds of corruption around in these countries that there may be in other countries. And I can't speak for Denmark. it sounds like it's a pretty great place to be. But I don't think it's possible to say that certainly about Canada. And there's all kinds of ways in which terrible things happen in sport that maybe aren't sort of the way in which people imagine corruption. Like maybe it's not money laundering, but actually it's actually worse, you know? But it's so established in the old boys system that it's just the way things are done. And so I think it's also, maybe people on the panel could address this. When we start coming like from the developed world, which is mainly a white world, I mean, look at the panel, look at the room. And we start talking about corruption as if it's in other countries where people might not look like us. I think it's a very dangerous, slippery slope.
It was a comment, as I heard it. You feel free to comment it if somebody wants at the panel. No? I have one more here and then over there.
Okay, my name is Osaso Bayowan, a journalist. I have a question for Mr. Eckert. For judicial authorities or prosecutorial bodies to carry out their duties effectively, they need to be completely insulated from political pressure. When you have a situation when the tenure of a judge or an ethics prosecutor is dependent on the executive branch of a sporting body, do you think that's right? How can you be completely insulated? Because if you are doing a good job, or people feel you're doing a good job, but people in the political sphere believe that the judge and the prosecutor are beginning to become too troublesome and a burden for political interests, and they can just be changed, then how does this help? And the other question I have, which is general, Mr. Nygaard was saying that it's important for sport to police itself rather than for political authorities to intervene. But the problem has been sport has had more than enough time to self-regulate and to correct its errors. And so far, it's doing a terrible job of it, which is why people are beginning to get fed up of sporting federations. So if they've had all this time, why do they need more time to self-regulate when it's clear that they can't?
Thank you.
May I start? Well, the duty of an ethics committee is not make a criminal case. The duty of the ethics committee is self-regulation of a sports body. And the sports organization is able to make her own law. So you have an ethics code as you like it. And then you have the duty to handle after this ethics code. The difference between a criminal case and ethics case is you take the people out of sport, only of sport. They are not allowed to be anymore in sport and handling, let's say, they're going to the VIP lounge and giving interviews and things like that. This is the reason for an ethics committee, to take them out of sport. The other part is prosecution office and a criminal case. And then you have to look what you will do with him. And I had a sense of talking about so-called pretty corruption or petty corruption. I know it from Southeast Europe. We have the same situation maybe in Africa or somewhere else. People are living with a sort of minimal corruption, and they want to have it, but we must accept it. This is a problem. For example, if you give $100,000 somewhere in the world, not in Europe, is it correct when the man to handle the money takes $10,000 for his and his family? Isn't it a crime, or is it correct? This is a question. You can handle it as a judge and look for the situation in his country. It's okay. but taking the money without a legal reason, it's corruption.
Yeah, we have Jens and Jens. And Jens will decide when we stop, because we are also running out of time. And I apologize for you. Yes, I'm sorry. No worry. I apologize for you who made an interest to raise a question. We don't have the time. Before you, Jens, a comment from a panel. Niels, yes, it was addressed to you a little bit.
Yes, I understand very much why many of you are losing patience. That we have a number of national federations, we have a number of international federations where the situation definitely is not very good. But first, I think it's not fair to say that everybody are crooks. There are a number of national federations, a number of NOCs. There are a number of international federations, for example, International Triathlon Union and other of the medium-sized international federations that are actually doing a very good job. So I think it's not fair just to say that all sport is corrupt and all sport is doing so bad and now we have to do something about it. And then I know that we should not start saying that everybody is doing it even worse than us. But if you look at the United Nations, how are they able to take care of all the things that are going on in the world with all the nations and all the corruption and all the things that are going on there? I don't believe they are doing a much better job than IOC and a number of international sports federations. So I don't think it's so easy just to say that let somebody else come in and take over.
Stan and then Jens.
Thank you. Well, I agree that to some extent the sports movement has failed to fulfill its responsibility in terms of governance, prevention of corruption. But it would be too easy to shift the blame to the sports movement and to consider that it's failure, because at the same time most government turned a blind eye on what was taking place. And it's quite recent that governments have the capacity to prosecute private corruption. And you may have listened this morning, Prosecutor Lourgouyou, who said, in many countries, an obstacle to prosecuting corruption is the fact that private corruption is just not an offense. And it's still the case in several countries, including European countries. And I would not say that it's a problem for Zimbabwe, China, and Papuasia. Even in Europe, there is much to do. And it's a challenge that should be addressed together, government and sports organizations.
Thank you. Jens?
I've got a question to Judge Eckert, since you mentioned whistleblowers. So I respect your experience as a prosecutor and judge very much, no question at all. But you mentioned whistleblowers, and my question is first, don't you regret that you and Garcia have almost burned 2 whistleblowers, that you almost, with your words, destroyed whistleblowers? And second question, do you regret that, or a question, why would you mention Blatter, I think at least 2 times in your verdict? Why would you mention Sepp Blatter and praise him, almost praise him in verdicts? A man who has created the FIFA system and a man who is now subject of criminal investigations.
Thank you for the question. Well, to the whistleblower ladies, the whistleblower ladies were at that time when the Garcia report came to me, not really protected, because both were in the media. And that's why I tried to find a way not to write too much about her, the both persons. Because Garcia himself wrote in his report he doesn't believe one of the whistleblowers. So you have a situation, you must prove for later investigations, can you use what she is telling, or can you it not use for an evidence? And in the statement of me, there's only a repeatment of what Garcia wrote down about Blatter. And the problem is, you shouldn't forget, we have the ISL report, the old one. You know it, most of you will know it, from the 1990s. And we have the Garcia report. And Garcia didn't find anything against Mr. Blatter in his investigations. And the only thing about Mr. Blatter are the 2 million paying for Mr. Platini. We haven't found, and that is open, we have not found he has taken any money more in an illegal way. So you must be careful telling about Mr. Blatter. He was sentenced, he was banned for some time for the 2 million, but not for any other corruption. And the ISL report, it was a long time ago. Most of the offenses which were in middle were not able to bring in court because it's a long time ago. And it was searched by 2 prosecution officers in Switzerland without no definitely real result. This is the situation. And I know some media told I was a so-called Mr. Blatter-Versteher because I didn't fit to the media and were aggressive to Mr. Blatter. I did my job, and as long as nothing was on my table, I couldn't do anything. And if the case came to my desk, I worked, nothing else. You must be very careful being an investigator or a judge in a job like that. And you only must be honest to yourself and even to the job. Be very, very careful, and even be careful by the media and pointing with fingers to some of the people who are doing and trying to job for self-regulation in all these organizations. It is not so easy. And if I ask for some control, I would definitely, it would very better if it is not a need to have an outside control, have a control for a good sport coming from inside, coming with transparency and with the faith in sport and the young people. This is my vision of a good sport.
Thank you, and I give the last question and also the task to close the session to Jens Sejer Andersen.
One comment, one piece of information, and one final question. The comment is, thank you very much for a very, very interesting discussion that shows that we have not asked this question for the last time. Because it's also a question of wording. Because when we are defending autonomy of sport, are we then defending freedom of association, a fundamental democratic right? Or are we defending protection of an industry that lives on the margins of a lawful society? And this is something that I would love to speak 10 minutes about, but that would have serious consequences for the dinner. So, the information is, for those who did not come early, you have 5 minutes to identify the place where you have your jacket, because the weather outside is not very good. We are going on 3 buses to Eindhoven, to refurbished industrial places of Philips that are now very lively, and where there is a restaurant, Radio Royale, in the old energy center of the old Philips factories. And first there will be a little sightseeing. I don't know how much sight we can see, but we will do our best. And then you will get further information at the restaurant, because we will split in 2 groups. Some to go to the Hub for Innovation, the offices, the SX building, and others to see some very interesting sports installations in the old Philips factory buildings. And there will be a free choice, more or less. We hope you will find out. But the question to round this excellent panel up is directed to the Olympic leaders here. Is it time for another round of deep-going reform at the IOC? And if yes, what would the 3 most important components be?
You have 2 minutes.
How long did you say we had?
5 minutes.
That's fine. Well, I think there is always time to be examining your structure and your governance. There's far more attention being paid to governance these days, and I think that's a good thing, because I think at the base, all corruption is a failure of governance. So getting that managed is I think the first order, and it's an ongoing issue. Whether you need a formal reform period or not, I don't really know. But I would like to, if I may, finish off with fair play for sausage, and you know, regarding self-inspection. Would you be more comfortable if your sausage was inspected by an underpaid, undertrained, and therefore vulnerable government inspector?
If I shall try and answer short, I'll say it's walk the talk. I think that the Olympic Agenda 2020 really lines out what has to be done. The problem is that there are still too many of all the issues in Agenda 2020 which is not really being done in practice. So I think we have all the ideas and all the things we want to do in the Olympic movement, and now we just have to do it.
Thank you, and since we have the next Play the Game conference 2019, there will be another option to test whether the 2020 we are getting nearer to the 2020 agenda. With this remark, I would like to thank very much on the panel. Thanks to a very, very good moderator and a very aware audience. Thank you. Nå. Ja, det skal man ikke vide, hvordan laves. Det er Nietzsche, Bismarck, som sagde...